We know now that in the early years of the 20th century, this world was being watched closely by intelligences greater than man's, and yet as mortal as his own. We know now that as human beings busied themselves about their various concerns, they were scrutinized and studied, perhaps almost as narrowly as a man with a microscope might scrutinize the transient creatures that swarm and multiply in a drop of water.
At 8 p.m. on October 30th of 1938, the Martians began their invasion of the planet Earth. Their landing point? Grover's Mill, New Jersey. A nice small town with scattered woods and farmlands. Grover's Mill lies just outside of Princeton, about 10 miles from Trenton and equidistant from New York City and Philadelphia. The invasion was announced over the radio by a 23-year-old named Orson Welles. The point of invasion was chosen at random. Orson Welles threw a dart on a map, and the hand of fate chose Grover's Mill. I, however, have come here with more deliberate intention, to see where the Martians invaded. The land of Grover's Mill was originally home to the Lenape. In the 1600s, a more terrestrial invasion occurred when the land was colonized by Europeans. The alleged story is that the land was bought by the Dutch von Nest family from a Lenape woman named Ida. In 1694, the first definitive purchase of land occurred when New Jersey Governor Andrew Hamilton bought 5,000 acres from the proprietors of East New Jersey. Colonists began settling the land in the mid-1700s. It was in 1759 that the titular mill was built on Bear Brook. The brook was dammed to create the adjacent pond. The mill originally featured a sawmill and a grist mill. The mill passed between different families over the years. It was originally owned by Daniel Walsey and then was purchased by Mahlon Wright in the mid-1760s. From the 1770s to 1816, it was owned by the Bergen family, and so the area was known as Bergen's Mill. From 1816 to 1837, it was owned by Benjamin and Richard Thomas, and so the area was known as Thomas Mill, or Bear Mill. From 1837 to 1868, it was owned by Gottlieb Schwenger, and so the area was known as, you guessed it, Schwenger's Mill. In 1868, it was bought by Joseph H. Grover, giving it the modern name of Grover's Mill. If the Martian invasion was successful, I have no doubt that the area would be known as Martian's Mill. It's got more of a ring to it than Schwenger's Mill, I can tell you that much. To my knowledge, the mill stopped functioning as a mill around World War II. I believe it to be a place of residence nowadays, but I'm not too sure. The broadcast was a Halloween episode of the CBS show, The Mercury Theater on the Air. The broadcast aired from the Columbia Broadcasting Building in Manhattan. The broadcast was an adaptation of the H.G. Wells novel The War of the Worlds. The broadcast was staged like a news bulletin, causing some listeners to believe that the invasion was real. Several actors played different characters, with Orson Welles serving as the announcer and as Professor Richard Pearson. The music was interrupted several times with reports of explosions on the surface of the planet Mars. A large metallic cylinder crash-landed in the forest near Grover's Mill. Several onlookers, including a reporter named Carl Phillips, gathered around the cylinder. Although smooth and metallic, it was dismissed as a meteor. Police officers in the crowd signaled peaceful intentions with a white flag, but their efforts were in vain. The cylinder revealed a heat ray which began blasting flames into the crowd. The forest was set on fire, and the Martians began attacking cars and houses next. Soon enough, the broadcast from Grover's Mill went quiet. The U.S. Army responded by sending in 7,000 soldiers. A giant, three-legged metal fighting machine rose out of the cylinder and began attacking them. The American Army began firing on the tripod, but with no effect. Their earthly ammunition had no effect against the Martian shield. The tripod annihilated the American Army with a heat ray, and then proceeded on from Grover's Mill to the rest of the world. It was then reported that the Martians also landed in the Great Swamp near Morristown, the Hudson River, and in different cities along the eastern United States. Some listeners took the broadcast seriously on account of the terrifying, vivid descriptions, the screams of death, and the pre-World War II anxiety over war and invasion. Keep in mind, this broadcast aired only a month after the Munich Pact. Some panicked citizens bombarded their local police stations demanding answers. One Midwestern mayor reported that the citizens of his town formed a mob in the street.
Everybody is going after their shotgun and going to Grover's Mills.
Many frightened people actually heard little, if any, of the actual broadcast. Instead, they caught word of urgent-sounding news bulletins at a time when there were plenty of real ones.
Around a half hour into the broadcast, police had trickled into the Columbia Broadcasting Building, attempting to stop the show. CBS executives stood in the way of the police, causing a great commotion. Following the backlash of the first half, the second half of the show was framed more like a traditional radio drama, and several disclaimers were made telling people that this was all fictional.
You are listening to a CBS presentation of Orson Welles and the Mercury Theater on the Air in an original dramatization of The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells. The performance will continue after a brief intermission. This is the Columbia Broadcasting System.
The second half followed Professor Pearson, who survived the Grover's Mill attack and took refuge in Newark, New Jersey. Pearson encounters a fascist militiaman who wants to take the Martian weaponry and control both the human and Martian races. He claims that humans are nothing more than a food source for the Martians. Pearson wandered the wreckage of Manhattan and found a pile of Martian corpses being scavenged by birds. It was revealed that the Martians died due to a lack of immunity to earthly pathogens. At the end of the broadcast, Orson Welles told the audience that it was all in good fun and was meant as a celebration of Halloween. The CBS higher-ups were very afraid of being held liable for causing public hysteria. Orson Welles apologized for the incident at a news conference the next morning while only operating on 3 hours of sleep. No action was taken against Orson Welles. In fact, he became well known as a trickster and an innovative storyteller. Outrage followed in the days and weeks after the broadcast, with some people calling for increased FCC regulations. Over 12,000 articles were written about the broadcast in the first 3 weeks after it aired. It was established that the newspapers exaggerated the extent of the public's panic. The majority of people who were fooled by the broadcast took action by calling their local police station for answers, rather than going into the street with a shotgun. The newspaper industry had suffered a loss in ad revenue due to the rising radio industry, and so they had a financial stake in making the radio look bad. They pounced on this opportunity and, unsuccessfully, pushed for increased government regulation of the radio industry. According to Orson Welles, Adolf Hitler actually referenced the broadcast in his speech at Munich on November 8th of that year. Hitler allegedly stated that the broadcast and its aftermath indicated the corrupt condition and decadent state of affairs of democracy. Because, Nazis never play on people's fears, and they certainly don't do so for much worse objectives. Orson Welles and author H.G. Wells met each other only once in October of 1940, since they were both lecturing in San Antonio, Texas. They discussed the false hysteria of the broadcast. And what about our landing point of Grover's Mill? In 1988, at the 50-year anniversary, a 4-day festival was held in celebration of the broadcast. There was a parade, planetarium shows, dancing, a buried time capsule, and a bronze monument erected in honor of the broadcast. I have never been to Roswell, New Mexico. However, I am familiar that their residents use alien culture for tourist revenue. Grover's Mill is much more modest with its connection to extraterrestrials. This could be because the broadcast was part of a known hoax, so there isn't any conspiracy theory culture keeping a mystery alive. While some people may still wonder about Roswell, New Mexico, Grover's Mill has always been said and done. However, I was pleased to find one remnant of the broadcast's mark on Grover's Mill outside of just the monument. I'm here at Grover's Mill Coffee, which was established in 2005. The decorations and art are all homages to the 1938 broadcast. There's even decorations referencing the 2 movies that were released.
This shop has been open since 2005. We were owned originally by a family called the DeFranco family, the DeFranco Gambatis family. They had the idea to open the shop back in 03, 02. It was one of the few historical moments in this town. This town was mainly farmland up until the 1980s. It's mainly, people come here just for the school system. We've built houses around the schools, but this is one of the few little historical bits, having the War of the Worlds happen here. We bought the Red Barn as seen in the big mural painting, and we originally planned to put the shop in there, set up a big roastery, and our main business was going to be selling bags of beans instead of coffee, doing wholesale. Unfortunately, it didn't work out. Someone poorly stored oil in the basement, or there was a pipe underneath the building that exploded and was going to be a multi-million-dollar cleanup. And so we sold that building. We found this great location here, just a few miles down the road, still in the same town, and we've been here for 18 years now, or 16 years, I believe, in this location.
The staff is welcoming, the food is great, the coffee is fresh, and the vibes are immaculate. I think it's beautiful that they've embraced their place in the Martian invasion. In 2018, I was a freshman at SUNY Purchase College in Westchester, New York. Me and my friend Giovanni Minio had a show on the campus's radio station WPSR. At first it was called the Chuckle Hour. Then it was changed to What's the News, where we talked about current events. In late October 2018, we did a parody of the War of the Worlds broadcast for the 80th anniversary. I exclaimed how aliens were invading the campus and even destroyed the food hall. I took shelter in the studio. And I made a lot of cheese puns. Anyway, the reveal was that the aliens were there for Giovanni. The joke was that Giovanni was adopted by the aliens, which explained the lack of resemblance. Despite the casual carnage, they were only there to pick him up for the weekend. Unfortunately, the recording was glitched and inaudible. It couldn't be saved. But we still have the script, and we still have the memory. And we still had fun. The War of the Worlds broadcast is fun, despite what newspapers or police officers or fascist dictators might tell you. It may have ruffled some feathers and caused some concern, but everybody with good sense had a laugh about it afterwards, and they still do to this day. Just remember not to believe everything you hear on the radio.
This is Orson Welles, ladies and gentlemen. Out of character, to assure you that the War of the Worlds has no further significance than as the holiday offering it was intended to be. The Mercury Theater's own radio version of dressing up in a sheet and jumping out of a bush and saying boo. Starting now, we couldn't soap all your windows and steal all your garden gates. By tomorrow night, so we did the best next thing. We annihilated the world before your very ears and utterly destroyed the CBS. You will be relieved, I hope, to learn that we didn't mean it and that both institutions are still open for business. So goodbye, everybody, and remember, please, for the next day or so, the terrible lesson you learned tonight. That grinning, glowing, globular invader of your living room is an inhabitant of the pumpkin patch, and if your doorbell rings and nobody's there, that was no Martian, it's Halloween.